There's something unsettling happening in the minds of people who grew up in the 1970s and 80s. Something most of them will never openly admit. They look at the world today and feel a profound disconnection, not just from technology or culture, but from their own former selves. The person they were at 25 would barely recognize the thoughts they carry now at 60. And this isn't nostalgia, it's something darker. It's the slow realization that the world didn't change them. They changed themselves by resisting a world that refused to stay still. Arthur Schopenhauer understood this centuries before social media, before the internet, before the collapse of certainty that defines our era. He recognized that human beings don't experience reality directly. We experience our own will, our desires, fears, expectations, projected onto everything around us. And when the external world no longer matches the internal map we've spent decades building, the mind doesn't adapt. It fractures. People from the 70s and 80s grew up in a world of stable narratives, clear roles, predictable futures. Then they watched all of it dissolve, and instead of evolving with that dissolution, many calcified. They cling to frameworks that no longer function, defending worldviews that reality has already abandoned. This isn't stubbornness. It's psychological self-preservation, because to admit that your foundational beliefs were temporary constructs would mean confronting the terrifying possibility that you never really understood yourself at all. If this kind of deep psychological reflection resonates with you, subscribe to Inner Truth Lab. Because what we're about to explore isn't comfortable, but it's true. The crisis runs deeper than generational disagreement. It's an internal war most people refuse to acknowledge. Those who came of age in the 70s and 80s were raised on promises: work hard, follow the rules, build a stable life, and meaning will follow. The formula was clear. The path was illuminated. And for a while, it worked, or seemed to. But then something shifted. The economic structures that rewarded loyalty collapsed into systems that reward opportunism. The social contracts that promised security revealed themselves as illusions. The cultural narratives that once unified entire generations splintered into 1,000 competing realities, each one claiming absolute truth. And the people who built their entire identities around those old promises found themselves standing on ground that no longer exists. This creates a specific kind of suffering. Not the suffering of loss, but the suffering of irrelevance. The realization that the skills you mastered, the values you internalized, the truths you held sacred, none of them carry the weight they once did. You look at younger generations and see not just different priorities, but a fundamentally different operating system. They don't want what you wanted. They don't fear what you feared. They don't believe what you believed. And that creates a psychological vertigo that most people can't name. So they respond the only way the mind knows how, when faced with existential disorientation. They double down. They insist the old ways were better. They interpret change as decline. They frame difference as deficiency. Not because they're stupid or close-minded, but because the alternative, admitting that their entire framework for understanding reality was contextual, temporary, and ultimately insufficient, is psychologically unbearable. The mind will defend its own coherence at almost any cost, even if that coherence is a fiction. Schopenhauer called it the will. Not willpower, but something more fundamental. The blind, relentless force that drives all living things toward survival, reproduction, meaning-making. According to Schopenhauer, we don't see the world as it is. We see the world through the lens of our will, our needs, our desires, our unconscious motivations. Reality becomes a projection screen for our internal drives. And here's where it gets psychologically dangerous. The will doesn't care about truth. It cares about continuity. It wants coherence, not accuracy. So when the external world shifts in ways that threaten your internal narrative, the will doesn't say, update your beliefs. It says, reject the new information, because updating your beliefs would mean admitting your previous beliefs were incomplete. And if your previous beliefs were incomplete, then who were you all those years you held them? People from the 70s and 80s built their identities during a specific historical moment, a moment that felt permanent but was actually an anomaly. Post-war economic expansion, clear cultural narratives, institutional trust. the illusion of progress as a straight line moving upward. They absorbed these conditions as fundamental truths about how the world works. And when those conditions evaporated, their minds faced a choice: adapt the internal map to match the external terrain, or insist the terrain is wrong. Most chose the latter, not consciously, but automatically, because the mind's primary function isn't to perceive reality accurately, it's to maintain psychological stability. And psychological stability requires consistency. So the same people who once embraced change as progress now experience change as threat. The same minds that once felt aligned with the future now feel alienated from it. Not because they became different people, but because the world stopped confirming their foundational assumptions. And confirmation is what the will craves most. The first insight is this: people don't resist change itself. They resist the invalidation of past choices. Every belief you hold, every value you've defended, every decision you've made was performed by a version of yourself operating within a specific context. When that context dissolves, those choices start to look arbitrary, maybe even foolish, and the mind cannot tolerate that level of self-doubt without fragmenting. So instead of saying, "I did the best I could with the information I had," people from older generations often say, "The world has gone mad." It's a defense mechanism disguised as cultural commentary. By framing the present as aberrant, they protect the past as righteous. By interpreting difference as deterioration, they preserve their own sense of having lived correctly. It's not about being right. It's about maintaining the story of having been right. The second insight cuts even deeper. Rigidity increases with investment. The more decades you spend building a life around certain assumptions, the more psychologically expensive it becomes to question those assumptions. This is why people in their 20s can pivot easily. They haven't accumulated decades of choices dependent on a single worldview. But someone in their 60s who built a career, raised children, formed relationships, and constructed entire meaning systems around specific beliefs? Questioning those beliefs isn't just intellectual, it's existential demolition. Schopenhauer would say this is the will protecting itself through denial, and denial is the mind's most powerful tool for avoiding suffering. Because suffering, according to Schopenhauer, comes from wanting reality to be different than it is. And nothing creates more suffering than realizing your entire interpretive framework was built on sand. So the mind rejects that realization before it fully forms. It labels the new world as broken rather than admit the old map was incomplete. Here's where it becomes tragic. The more someone defends outdated beliefs, the more isolated they become. Not just socially, but psychologically. Because the world keeps moving forward, and if you refuse to update your understanding, you're essentially choosing to live in a reality that no longer exists. You become a ghost, haunting your own life, present in body, but absent in meaningful engagement with what's actually happening. This manifests in specific ways: constant complaints about how things used to be, dismissal of anything unfamiliar as inferior, an inability to learn new systems or adapt to new norms because learning would require admitting you don't already know. And beneath all of that, a quiet, corrosive loneliness that comes from feeling fundamentally out of sync with the world around you. But the consequences go beyond individual suffering. When entire generations refuse to update their thinking, they create cultural friction that slows collective evolution. They occupy positions of power while operating from frameworks that no longer apply. They make decisions based on outdated assumptions. They resist innovations that threaten their psychological coherence. And the world pays the price for their inability to adapt. The irony is that many people from the 70s and 80s once prided themselves on being forward-thinking. They were the generation that questioned authority, challenged traditions, demanded change. But somewhere along the way, they became the authority they once questioned. They became the tradition they once challenged. Not because they fundamentally changed, but because they stopped changing while the world kept moving. And now they find themselves defending the very structures they once rebelled against. Not because those structures are good, but because those structures feel familiar. And familiarity, to an aging mind, often masquerades as truth. Understanding this creates a profound shift in how you see not just others, but yourself. Because if you're honest, you can probably already feel the early stages of this pattern forming in your own mind. Those moments when you catch yourself thinking things were better before. Those instances where you dismiss something new without really examining it. Those flashes of irritation at cultural shifts you don't fully understand. This isn't a moral failing. It's a psychological inevitability unless you actively resist it. The mind naturally seeks stability, and stability feels like truth. But truth and stability are not the same thing. Truth requires constant updating. Stability requires constant defending. And every year you live, the temptation to choose stability over truth becomes stronger. The transformation comes from recognizing this process before it calcifies. From understanding that your resistance to new ideas isn't about the ideas themselves, it's about protecting the version of yourself who made sense in a world that no longer exists. And once you see that mechanism clearly, you can choose differently. You can hold your beliefs more lightly. You can approach unfamiliar concepts with curiosity instead of defensiveness. You can admit when your framework no longer fits without feeling like you're betraying your past self. This is the kind of reflection we explore deeply here at Inner Truth Lab. Because awareness doesn't eliminate the psychological patterns Schopenhauer described, but it does give you a choice in how you respond to them. You can let your will drag you into rigidity and isolation, or you can consciously choose intellectual humility and continuous evolution. The world will keep changing either way. The only question is whether you'll change with it or spend your remaining years defending a reality that's already gone. Schopenhauer believed that suffering is the default human condition because the will is insatiable. It always wants more, always wants different, always wants control. And nowhere is this more visible than in the minds of people desperately trying to freeze time in their favor. They want the world to stop changing, so their beliefs can finally be validated as permanent truths. But the world never stops. It can't. Change is the only constant. The final realization is this: generational thinking patterns aren't about generations at all. They're about the universal human struggle between growth and preservation, between adapting to reality and forcing reality to adapt to you. People from the 70s and 80s aren't fundamentally different from people today. They're just further along in the same psychological journey everyone takes. The journey from flexibility to rigidity, from curiosity to certainty, from questioning to defending. And if you understand this now, while you're still capable of changing course, you have a rare opportunity. You can decide that your beliefs are tools, not identities. That being wrong about something doesn't invalidate who you were when you believed it. That evolution isn't betrayal. That the measure of a life well lived isn't how consistently you held the same views, but how honestly you questioned them when reality demanded it. This is the difference between wisdom and stubbornness. Wisdom knows that all frameworks are temporary. Stubbornness believes its framework is eternal. And the tragedy of watching older generations struggle isn't that they're wrong. It's that they're trapped in a pattern they can't see, defending beliefs they can no longer examine, living in a world that exists only in their minds. You don't have to follow that path. But avoiding it requires something most people never develop: the courage to remain uncertain in a world that rewards the appearance of certainty above all else. If this exploration challenged the way you think about yourself and the world, that's exactly what this channel is for. Inner Truth Lab isn't about easy answers or comfortable platitudes. It's about confronting the uncomfortable psychological realities that shape human behavior, including your own. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this. Have you noticed these patterns in people around you? Have you noticed them forming in yourself? What beliefs are you holding on to that might need examining? The conversations that happen in the comments here often reveal insights even deeper than the videos themselves because they come from real people wrestling with real internal conflicts. If you found value in this, subscribe to Inner Truth Lab. This is a space for people who want to understand themselves and others at a level most content never reaches. No hype, no manipulation, just truth, depth, and the kind of psychological reflection that actually changes how you see reality. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who seems stuck in old ways of thinking, or someone who's struggling to understand why certain people refuse to adapt, share this video with them. Not as a judgment, but as an invitation to think more deeply about what drives human resistance to change. We'll continue exploring the darkest, most honest aspects of human psychology here, because the truth isn't always comfortable, but it's always worth pursuing. That's what makes us human. Not the beliefs we hold, but the willingness to question them when the world demands it. See you in the next one.